Juliet, who were some of Branwell's literary influences?
Well, I think the first and the most important one is Blackwood's magazine, which was published in Edinburgh from about 1817 onwards. And it's an absolute cornucopia of information, of drama, of stories, of poetry, and the Brontes plundered it mercilessly. And there were fantastic reviews of books that were sort of 20 pages long, so you got a really good idea of the stories behind it. That's where Emily and Anne picked up the characters that then would become their characters in their imaginary world. But you find that with Branwell, I think, the most important one was the Noctes Ambrosiana, which was a series that was produced regularly through Blackwood's, and it's really scurrilous, and it's a whole set of literary figures from Edinburgh, including James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd, and John Wilson, Professor John Wilson, and they're sending each other up mercilessly, taking the mickey out of each other. They're drinking heavily. They have a dog called Brontë. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? So, of course, he's fascinated by all this, and he takes those and turns them into conversations in Bravy's Inn, and they copy. He particularly copies these stories, invents his own characters for them, but uses that format, and it's a huge influence on him. And this is where both Branwell and Charlotte pick up that sort of sarcastic tone, the mickey-taking, the idea that they have these sort of swaggering male heroes who go around, and they're always in the pothouse or whatever. And it's all taken from that in the sense of its tone and in the sense of its characters too. But Branwell was also a devotee of Byron. He loved Byron's poetry, knew it off by heart well enough as a young teenager to be able to quote lines from it in his little magazines that he wrote. But he was also passionate about Walter Scott, as were all the Brontë children. And they had the novels of Walter Scott had a huge influence on their own writing. And there's one fantastic story that Branwell wrote, and the beginning of it says, literally, I'm paraphrasing horribly, but it's something along the lines of, I've only got to look out of my window to see exactly the same scene as Walter Scott describes in Tales from My Grandfather. So for them, they identified hugely with it because it's a similar sort of scenery. Walter Scott's characters are hugely attractive because they're young, they're romantic, and people like Rob Roy, Branwell virtually turns him into a character of his own. He takes on those characteristics, turns him into the rover, and has all sorts of stories that are written about him. So you can see how all those influences fed in. But also he was passionately interested in the classics too. He was a very good classic scholar. He knew Latin and Greek. And so stories from that background too feed in, so that you get a lot of more pretentious type of poetry that is meant to be similar, not like Keats on Ode on the Grecian Urn, but that sort of thing that feeds into his ideas as well.
And we know that Branwell continued to write in adulthood stories like The Wool is Rising and a possible novel. Can you tell us anything about these works?
Well, Branwell never stopped writing. He was like his sisters. He wrote right through, all from being a child right through to adulthood. And he was toying with the idea of writing novels, even for publication. He had that idea even before his sisters had that idea. And the stories that he was writing, because we've got the manuscripts, are very similar in tone and in setting to Wuthering Heights. And in fact, there's even a story that went round after he died that some of his friends had been shown, he'd met them in the pub and he'd read them the beginning of the Wuthering Heights, and so they were all convinced he'd written Wuthering Heights. It isn't. It's one of Branwell's stories, but again it shows you how closely they worked together and also how they influenced each other. So that is a very important issue from Branwell.
Okay.